Now, you touched a bit about human rights. And guess what? I have someone here who is an expert in human rights for older people and requiring social care. We know that human rights in older people and in general is wildly overlooked. And this is a fact. So we need to do more talks about it. I have a holder of a doctorate in gerontology with a background in investigative journalism, a specialist on critical human rights standards for older people and international human rights. Now, I'd ask you to help me welcome Dr. Caroline Green. Thank you.
Thank you so much for introducing me, and thanks so much for having me. And before I start, I want to thank people here, and you know who you are. Susan, Nuno, Tessa, people I've been working with on this really difficult topic for several months now, and it takes a lot of courage, and I'll come to that in a minute, but thank you so much for having me. And yeah, so I'll be talking about human rights research, but from the perspectives of people living in care homes. This is not going to be a legal presentation. It's also not going to be about people living with dementia, even though I will also talk about people living with dementia for a bit. It's also not a presentation about COVID-19 and the situation that I've just touched on a little bit. It's about work that I've done before COVID-19 and afterwards, and I want to share with you. So before I start with actually what people have told me, that human side, which I think is the most important that we're going to be talking about, I do have to go into a little bit of the more technical, and please do bear with me, those of you who know much about human rights. I'm just going to introduce them a little bit to tell you what they are and how they apply to care homes, especially here in England. It's different for every country, and England has a very special system. And then I'm going to be talking about some of the topics that people living in care homes have raised with me in my work around human rights. And then I'm going to be talking briefly about some of the research priorities that come out of this. So let me start by defining human rights and how they're relevant from a legal regulatory point of view in this country specifically. So yes, human rights are, first of all, we just heard that, it's the rights and freedoms that we all have simply because we're human beings. Doesn't matter who we are. Doesn't matter whether we live in a care home or we don't live in a care home, or whether we have disabilities or not, or are living with dementia. We all have the same human rights and freedoms as anybody else. It is thereby, I think that's also really important. It is a legal concept. I think most people think of it as a legal concept. It's enshrined in documents like the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, I'm sure you all are aware of, but it's also really importantly a moral and ethical concept, something that even if we didn't have these legal documents there, it's something where the world community has come together and said, these are the rights and freedoms that we want for everyone, and we want to make sure that everyone has got them, can enjoy them. So some of the examples of the human rights and freedoms that we have, and we broadly think of socio-economic and civil political rights, include the right to life, the prohibition of torture and inhumane or degrading treatment, the right to liberty and security, and the right to respect for private and family life. And these are specific rights written down, for example, in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It's quite often we will hear people who say, well, this is the right, and that I have somewhere where I can park my car, that's a human right to me. But I actually define human rights by what is laid down in these documents, because otherwise we just have too many of them and we wouldn't quite know what right is actually a human right. But those are some of the examples that I'm sure you have come across, especially in the past few years. The equality and dignity, those are fundamental principles. We also often hear there's a right to dignity, there's a right to equality. They're more than that. They are fundamental principles that underlie all human rights and freedoms. If we have our rights and freedoms respected and protected, we have a life in dignity. That's what it says within these documents. That's how the whole thought process around it, it's built on that, and that very principle of equality, that we are all the same in the eyes of human rights, and doesn't matter what our characteristics are. So they're fundamental principles that we want to obtain. So who is actually responsible for ensuring human rights? So when we think of the legal concept, it's mostly government and public authorities really under law. That is, that where we say they need to protect and respect human rights, they need to put something in place or refrain from violating rights. But in the past, 10, 20 years or so, we've seen much more engagement also on the level of the United Nations, and a much bigger understanding that private businesses and the managers are also responsible for human rights, just because their actions have so much repercussions on people, what businesses do. And we've seen some massively bad things happening out of what some businesses are doing in some countries. And so we've now got more of an international understanding, and also some documents that say that private businesses are also really responsible for protecting and respecting rights and freedoms. But also it's us. In the end, I like to think of human rights as something that comes alive in the relationships that we have with each other. If I steal someone's property, I've in a way violated their rights. So really, it actually also says in our documents that it's the people towards each other who don't only have these rights, we also have these obligations towards each other. And it is about us, you and me, how we interact with each other. So it's not just public authorities and government, but I still think it's really up there. So why is there so much talk around care homes? Of course, we've just heard what happened with COVID-19 and so on, but there was already quite a lot of human rights talk actually around care homes in this country, also in some other countries like Germany, before COVID-19. And why is that? So, I mean, of course, we've heard from the Dutch study, we don't actually have proper data yet that tells us exactly who lives in care homes, but we do know that it's mostly older women. Actually, it's larger demography of people who live in care homes. Many people, as we've now also heard and know, are living with dementia, other kinds of cognitive and physical impairment. And what that means is care homes are already becoming spaces of intersectional disadvantage, which means that there are risk factors that often lead to people experiencing human rights violations come together in a person within care homes. There are places of community where people move into, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later regarding what people have told me is important to them. And we also know that it is a sector that is in crisis. Many people don't like to use that word, but we hear it and it is true. We have a financial crisis with staff and so on. I'm not going to go into that. We've heard so much about it now. But what that means is that care homes become places where lots of people with different characteristics come together, stress a lot of different situations that are really tricky from a human rights point of view. And then we also still live in a society where we do have the isms a lot. We have ageism, we have ableism, we have racism, and that also plays out in all spheres of our lives, and of course also in care homes. But we've had all of this media, a lot of media reporting around care homes also pre-COVID already, and we've had a lot going on in terms of law and regulation of why, and that made human rights so important when it comes to care homes in this country. So from a regulatory and legal point of view, England is really quite unique because as I'm sure you all know, we've got the Human Rights Act, 1998, which directly translates the European Convention on Human Rights and Freedoms into English law. So that means anybody who is in this country can draw on the Human Rights Act and say, if a public authority has violated their rights, then I'm going to work with the Human Rights Act. So this particular Human Rights Act in 2007, there was a case where a person living in a care home, in a private care home, was wanting to draw on the Human Rights Act and say something has happened here where the care home has violated my rights. And I feel that a care home is really, you know, is performing a function of public nature and should be seen as a government organization. So I want to use the Human Rights Act. And they said, oh, no, you can't do that because it's a private company and the Human Rights Act doesn't apply to private companies. And there was a huge outburst after that. And there's a lot going on in Parliament and advocacy groups who said, that's not okay. We feel that care homes should actually be obligated under the Human Rights Act and should have these direct human rights obligations. And we now have in the Care Act 2014, we've got a section 73, which says that care homes do perform a function of public nature and are therefore directly liable under the Human Rights Act, but only in the case of people who are partly funded by local authorities. So people who are self-funded, and we now know it's over 40%, cannot draw on the Human Rights Act directly. I'll just leave that here as something that, has also been recently spoken about again, also in government. Anyway, so what I want to say here is that care homes do have these legal obligations under the Human Rights Act, and that's really quite a big thing. And we've also got other pieces of law. The Equality Act and the Mental Capacity Act, and all of these are based on human rights, right? And people in care homes are also subject to these, and therefore, again, just shows how important human rights is from a legal point of view. But also the Care Quality Commission has adopted in 2010 a human rights approach to regulating and inspecting care services. So when they come into a care home and they inspect it, they will look for certain human rights, and they're also planning on doing more work. So human rights are certainly becoming more and more important within that system. So that is really just me summarizing of why, from that legal point of view, it is so important. But now I want to step away from all of this legal talk and the regulatory talk. I really want to talk about the human side of human rights and what it matters, how it matters to people in care homes. So where did I find out all of this? So my PhD study was all about the perspectives of people living, working, and visiting care homes on human rights. And I want to stress here, it's really important that we really think about everybody and talk about to everyone when it comes to human rights, not just staff or residents or relatives, but everyone together, because everyone is in it together. We're all in it together. So that was my PhD studies. I then did some involvement activities to co-produce research priorities, also involving people living here in these two beautiful care homes. And within these involvement activities, I really wanted to find out what's important to people. What research do they want to see? So that was also some of the research I did. Then I recently did some research on 28 days to leave notices. Some people call them eviction notices from care homes, mostly with families of residents. And within the kind of work I've done, other bits and pieces, I've mostly worked with people who have capacity to consent to taking part in the research activities, which means that there are limitations with the people living with dementia, other cognitive impairment, who cannot consent to taking part in this research. And for me, this is a really big and important limitation to the research I've done, because human rights research has to be inclusive and we have to listen to everybody. And of course, one might now say, and I also know that talking to people, human rights is a very abstract topic for many. So talking to a person with severe dementia about human rights, you're not probably going to get very far, but we have so many different ways of communicating with people about their needs, about different topics that are human rights relevant, that we have to see more human rights research that is individualized to people living with cognitive impairment, with dementia. I also want to talk just mention another big elephant in the room here. And that is, and I've just seen it too, listening to everybody, human rights, the topic is a hugely emotionally loaded topic for many people. Really emotional. And that is because the common associations with human rights are it's politics, It's about abuse, violation. It's about loss. It's about shifting blame, accountability, who has done what wrong, what injustices and inequalities have happened. Yeah. And that's what makes it such a difficult topic to work with. However, I come from the perspective that human rights is, yes, of course, it is about, inequalities, about things that have gone wrong. But I actually come from the perspectives that it's a normative concept, something that we want to build on. We want to build up rather than tear down. So that's where I'm trying to come from. And I'm always trying to communicate that to the people I work with, to take away some of the fear when I interview them about human rights. And staff will then be, oh my God, no, I don't know anything. I'm going to hide. And it's really difficult to get care homes to work with me because they are scared. They're simply scared of what's going to happen. So coming from that perspective, that's something good we want to build on rather than tear down. That's where I'm coming from. So has really important ethical considerations going into care homes to do human rights research. So let's go to some of the most important part of this presentation. What have residents told me is important to them from a human rights point of view? What I want to mention first is quite often I've heard people say to me, oh, residents, they don't really know anything about human rights. It's not true. Every single resident I have interviewed, and that's now nearly 100 or spoken to about human rights, they always all knew what human rights are, all of them. Yeah. So, so it's quite often when I have these statements here, it's something a summary of what people have told me rather than specifically here. But one person strikingly said to me, you know what, I did not know that we still had any human rights at all. I thought that when we move in here, that we just lose them because, there's a place here when I'm not really allowed to do anything anymore that I want to do, even though I've really got capacity. So that was really a shared sentiment amongst many of the residents, but not all of them. And I think that's also really important, is I've actually had residents say to me, look, I chose to come here, and this is a much better place for me because at home I didn't have the amenities, I didn't have people around me, I was socially isolated, and now I feel much more empowered being here. So not everybody felt that way, but most people do. And I think that this shared sentiment of having lost rights, I think it's something that really needs to be unpacked. What I mean is we need more research that goes into the different perspectives of people. How do they really understand human rights? Why do they feel that they don't have any anymore? I think it's very, we can't make sweeping statements here. I think it's something where you need to talk to people more of why do they feel that way. So I think that I did not know that we still had any human rights. Generally raises a massive fundamental question on how we as a society and communities, and also how residents view themselves as citizens. How do we actually engage with people? And what do we also say, what does it actually mean, the concept of human rights to people? So, how do we want to engage with it in research, and how do we want to bring people into the communities? So I sometimes wonder, whenever I also listen to these amazing presentations today, all of them touched on human rights topics. Yeah, all of them did, but we didn't talk of them necessarily in a human rights way. And that sometimes also makes me wonder just how useful is it actually even to use human rights as a concept in research? Yeah, or do we want to be aware of it, but do we actually want to do research the way that is already happening out there anyway? Then we can put human rights analysis. Why am I asking this question? Just to go back to the point about just how emotional and difficult a topic it is. So I want to also perhaps controversially raise the question, how useful is it to work with this concept for us? Just to leave it there. Another interesting point that people raised is, residents raised, they said, and this is paraphrased and summarized, so we are moved, quite a lot of people said, into a community of people we did not choose to live with, people we do not know, and we are expected to fit in. Despite living in this community, it can be a really lonely place. And so when people told me that, I also tried to unpack it again with them. What does it actually mean to them. And I was like, yeah, okay, so people are moving into a place with a community of people they did not choose. They're spending much more time here with these people than you would perhaps normally in your life before, in your own home, where you can choose who you want to be with, where you go, and so on. And it raises really important questions around inclusion. People come in here, but sometimes they don't mean here, generally. They don't actually feel included, even though there are lots of people. There are issues around discrimination, about privacy, of course, freedom of expression, and social participation. So also, I don't really want everybody to know about, who I am. So how am I going to deal with that? So a question here that came out of that is, how can the experiences be improved of the people moving into a care home and people living in the care home when it comes to these human rights matters, of living in a community they haven't chosen to be in? And then there are a lot of matters of identity and choice and control and independence that came out of what people told me. So there's a lot about, and often there's a lot of emotions around that too, control over finances, that they don't feel like they can go and get to their bank account or to a bank and get some money out. So they're going to always have to ask someone to pay for them for something. Then that already means sometimes they need a passport to go to a bank, but they don't have a passport anymore. And people tell them, well, you don't need a passport anymore because, why would you? You're not traveling. And there's issues around control over property. So what property is mine? How can I protect it? Someone's stolen something or not? So that's something that came out. Then being able to spend time with individuals. So also partners, spouses who are maybe in the same home, one person living with dementia, the other isn't. How can we still ensure that there's, some time that we can be together and spend that time together? And then also simply that point of being able to go outside, even if it's, the grounds, without having to ask for permission. So one person said, sometimes I just want to go for a little walk in the garden with my walking stick, and I'm told that no one has time right now. What can possibly happen to me when I want to go and see the flowers in the garden? And of course, this raises these important questions around relationships between residents, staff who have duty of care, or this legal burden on them, but also family members and relatives and how they interact with the person who's living in the care home and with staff. So human rights, as you can see, is a topic about humans, about our life, about loss and identity and keeping things and just staying who we are, and trying to juggle all of these different kind of emotions and duties that we have. So some of the research priorities is really, I think we still need to define and strengthen human rights research more explicitly, because we see more of it now being used within different kinds of research. And sometimes you'll see oh, well, this is a human rights issue. Yes, it's true. But I think we really need to be doing very specific human rights research that is not just legal, that is about psychology, that is about well-being, about quality of care, and so on. All of that needs to be brought into this human rights research bucket. And we need courageous research that takes on this topic in all its forms. And that means, it needs to stay appreciative. It needs to be about what is already working well and what can we do better, rather than who is to blame, what's being violated, and how can we make sure that these people are taken in, hold accountable for it. So I think we really need this really courageous research that works that way up and that takes everybody on board: residents, staff, families, GPs, volunteers, communities, absolutely everybody. And I think if we do it thoughtfully and if we do it together, then it's got such a power to change the lives for the better, everybody's lives. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, so are there any questions? I saw that there are some. I'll get to you. Yes, please. Okay, then we'll go here first and then the lady over there.
Hi,
sorry.
I'm Rachel. I'm one of the physios that actually works at Nightingale Hammerson.
Hi.
I know you're doing great research into the human rights and gathering how everyone feels, what do we do, but where do you, or how do you plan to implement what you've found? How do we put this into practice? How do we ensure that human rights are being met? You know, is it going to come in like the data set? Is it going to become something like that? Are we gathering evidence on what we're doing to implement it? I just wondered where your research, you plan to take it into, you know, into care homes and how we practice it.
Yeah, I think that this is something that so many people have a big question mark. They're like, okay, but that's great in theory, but what does it mean in practice? I think actually, first of all, a lot of the things that are already being done in care homes, so whether it's activities, whether it's providing high quality care, you know, all of this, that's human rights in practice. It's about the individuals, it's about relationship-centered care. So it's actually already being done a lot. And it's just more, you know, that's what I meant by being appreciative of what is already being done and what can we do more of, rather than reinventing the wheel. And just because we look at human rights, it's always something like, oh, there's loss, there's a human rights violation. We haven't put our thoughts and our focus on what are we actually already doing really well and what is lifting and protecting human rights. So I think that's important. But then there are also bits and pieces that haven't been done. So, for example, the Joint Committee on Human Rights, members of Parliament, they did an inquiry into human rights in care settings not very long ago, gathering from people and the public views on human rights in care settings. There was not one submission from people directly capturing people's voices in care homes. And I mean, how important is that? So actually what we did here at Nightingale Hammerson is that we did that. We gathered people's views and we made a submission, and like this, you know, it's hopefully doing something. So it's little bits and pieces like that as well. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Hi, my name's Michelle. I've got my mother here at Hammerson, but I also have a son who is severely autistic and has been living in the care system for 11 years. I just wondered if any research has been done on human rights in working-aged adult homes rather than older people's care homes, because they too have human rights and they are so often forgotten, as we found during the pandemic. And I can't tell you the amount of times I've had to threaten people with, you know, what about his human rights and the Disability Discrimination Act, just to get him a parking permit outside the home that he now lives in. They said he wasn't entitled to one because he's living in a care home. I mean, work that one out. You know, and I just wondered if any research was going on into younger people, working age adults homes. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I think it's really, really true. We are concentrating on older people and younger people living in care homes. There is not much human rights studies done. There's, first of all, not very much human rights studies done on care homes generally, but certainly not on younger people. And we are trying to address that more, working with, coming up with like the Human Rights and Social Care Forum that we've just created, where we've also got people, younger people living in care homes coming in, trying to get their voices lifted. But yes, there needs to be more research around younger people. So thank you for raising that. Yes, sorry, I think there was something there, Annie.
Okay, my name is Stephen Eisen. I'm a community support practitioner, like an outreach community support worker for Nightingale Hammerson and for Jewish Care. You haven't mentioned the word DoLS, deprivation of liberty safeguards, and I've always felt that human rights in care homes was a DoLS situation. You've also got the subject of capacity. You've also got the subject of a course of protection. And so often there seems to be a great weakness, people with lasting power of attorneys and people without going to courts of protection. And how do you perceive the future is going, dichotomy between human rights and all those other provisions?
Well, so I think, so when it comes to DoLS mental capacity, so the Mental Capacity Act and the principles that underlie it are human rights based, but we know from research that unfortunately in a lot of care settings, not just care homes, people don't actually know how to implement them. And I think that is the problem with a lot of legal, you know, foundations and in theory and so on. It's nice to have, But in practice, it takes a lot more work to actually, training very targeted responses to make sure that people understand of what it's actually all about. So I think if we don't have that kind of insight of what we actually need to help people practically put things into practice of what we've got in law, then that's going to be very difficult bringing into the future. So I think we need more of that too. And that's why it's so important to do this kind of research to understand what's going on.
Thank you. Hello. Excuse me. I'm Annie Stevenson. I think we know each other, Caroline, from my Home Life programme. Very good to be here. I'm sorry I got caught up in traffic this morning. I was a bloody nightmare, so I'm sorry I haven't been able to pick up on the earlier presentations, but I'm just interested in linking what you've been saying so rightly with what we were hearing earlier. And I was working very actively in 2008 at Help the Aged on human rights in care homes and quality. And for me, so I got two questions for you, because I'm really keen to hear your latest thinking on all of this. But for me, the Human Rights Act, it is a set of principles and values that is there, which health and social care need to embody. So it's not just social care, it's the NHS as well. And it's all, and you're absolutely right, it's all about the isms. For me, it's an instrument to tackle age discrimination, which is the underlying rot that's endemic in the system. So to answer, Connor, I'm just thinking so much about your plea that you gave about the way you were treated in social care is discriminated against. For me, this underlying issue about age discrimination is reflected in social care being discriminated as well. So the people who are closest to those who need the care, who are discriminated against in the system, and it comes right through. So it's reflected in social care and its workforce. So my question to you about the policy that was mentioned about discharging residents of care homes of hospitals into care homes during the pandemic, which was an act of panic, I think, in the Department of Health and Social Care. Do you think that contravened the Human Rights Act, given that they knew how contagious the virus was and the risk to right to life? So that was my first question, and there's got another one.
Well, actually, we know there was a court case tapping into human rights, and the court said they did not contravene what's the right to life, other human rights. They did say they still contravened law generally, but not human rights. So, but then, we always also have to realize that, maybe that's really controversial what I'm saying, is that also judges are also just human beings. And we do actually see, waves of how human rights are being used within courts or not. But if we really just look at the legal point of view, the way it is right now, it has been decided that this policy was not against human rights law.
Right.
From a legal point of view.
Okay.
I did say it's a moral concept too.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about attitudes, it's about core values and beliefs and discrimination, as we were mentioning. So the other question is, I'm aware of the government not really liking the Human Rights Act.
Yeah, fortunately.
How worried are you about this being weakened, being diluted, being got rid of?
I'm really worried about the political climate around human rights, and what we've seen now for a really long time. And I think human rights advocates are pretty exhausted by now, especially because we've had one person out of the government who's really quite leading in all of this, Dominic Raab, who's now back in. So we have an uncertain future. But on the other hand, I see that there is so much more, not just interest, but engagement from the broad public. So even though we have this political climate that's, we don't know where it's going, we've got the public who's very much behind human rights, and certainly in health and social care. I mean, whatever kind of events we do around human rights and social care, we have them filled up within a couple of days by people in the communities, people working in care settings, local authorities. So there, I think there's a lot of hope in a time where it seems quite gloomy.
Thank you. I feel better now. Thank you very much.
Hi, I have a question from Julianne Meyer. She thanks you for your presentation, and she would like to know if you can expand on your experience in human rights in different countries in care homes.
Yes, first of all, hi to Julianne. Hope you're well. It's nice you are here. Yes, so human rights in care homes has certainly become in other countries also more of a topic during COVID-19. There was more discourse around it, but the situations, so Australia, for example, has very much a very sort of a lot of human rights discourse around around care homes, and a lot of academics and advocates and so on who are working with this topic. And in Germany less so, in Canada again. So you see, you know, different kinds of countries have different levels of engagement, but then we have the United Nations level, of course, where we're seeing more of a push towards a convention on the rights of older persons, where care homes and care settings on long-term care is certainly a really, really big topic, and that's being spoken about. Sorry, I didn't know who was first. Yeah, okay, please. And then yes, Susan, and then there was a lady here too.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Chipema. I'm head of care for Jewish care. Thank you for your presentation. One of the things that I wanted to find out is the dilemma. There's a dilemma within health and social care about between regulation, the Care Act. I think some of the issues that Stephen was talking about, and also human rights, because oftentimes I think in social worker staff are kind of caught into that conundrum. I think of balancing the needs and regulation, Care Act, and the rights of people that they care for. And so my question is, do you have any scope within your research to actually expand that, interrogate that a bit more, so that we can probably have some of the answers that we probably don't have now? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's that point around the different kinds of duties that also people within providing care in care homes have with duty of care. I mean, that's what it's mostly about now, and we also saw that within COVID-19 with the visitation guidelines. I mean, those were guidelines only to let visitors in, but it was actually law that you had a duty of care to protect people. So there was that where people were, providers, staff were very torn. We're like, okay, well, we need to protect people from COVID-19 infection. So it's I think what's happening there is, again, with the law, we've got something in law, but we don't actually understand how it really plays out in practice and what we can do to help people to navigate these circumstances, which sometimes, or well, actually most of the time, just seem impossible. So especially when it comes to staff, they're saying, well, we're trying, but we just can't win. That we can't win. I hear that all the time from staff, and they're saying we're doing our best, but we're exhausted. And I think here, as human rights researchers, we also have to be really careful that we don't do more harm than good. Because if we go into care homes and talk to staff and say, well, you're not doing this well enough, and it's human rights matter, at some point, and often people are already like, well, okay, now what, I'm giving up. And then we're left with a situation that we're already in anyway. I think Professor Livingston.
Hi, Caroline, that was really interesting, and thank you. I was completely shocked, and it was a revelation to me to know that people who pay their own fees are not under the Human Rights Act. Is there any other, I thought naively that human rights were just something that everybody would be under, you couldn't be excluded. Are there any other groups that are excluded from? No,
it's literally just thousands of self-funders.
Yeah, but they're the only groups in Britain that are, that's very interesting.
In
indeed.
England, yeah.
And maybe lots and lots of people don't know about that. That would be a very shocking revelation, perhaps, for many people.
It's the Joint Committee on Human Rights has raised this very issue. and we're waiting for a response from the government of what they've got to say.
Thank you very, very much. That was the fantastic. Can you all hear me? It was a great talk. And I had a special interest to me. I was a trustee of the British Institute of Human Rights. And I also worked with the British Geriatric Society as Dignity Champion. And I was interested, we had some charters on enabling people to have bowel and bladder care, or to make sure that they were able to use the toilet in private. Because I think that's one of the breaches of the Human Rights Act. It's assumed that everybody's not able to control their bowels or their bladder. And I think that's a major loss of human rights to them. And we did some other things as well, which I'll send you if you're interested. So it's very, very interesting and very important work you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And the British Institute of Human Rights, who I'm, by the way, completely independent of, so no advertisement, they're doing massively good work around human rights in care settings and training that is so important, and I know is really helping people to make sense of it in practice. Susan.
Hi, Susan Grant.
Hi.
Caroline, I just really want to thank you. You talked about being courageous. I think you're courageous. I really do. You've certainly made my eyes wide open to what we need to be doing, not only us, but all care homes. And I think the more research we do, the more we'll understand. So I really thank you. It's been great working with you, and I hope we'll be able to continue. So.
Thank you. Yeah, and I also just want to, before I end, say a special thank you to all the residents who've worked with us on this topic. They are really important in all of this, the most important. So, thank you.